has got to go! Hey, hey! Just got to go! My first
APD has got to go! Hey, hey! APD has got to go! Hey, hey!
Right here.
Oh!
Right here, buddy.
APD has got to go! Hey, hey! Oh!
Whose streets? Our streets! Whose streets?
Our streets!
Take back our streets!
Yo!
I can't go over there, I'll get arrested.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Did y'all get arrested last night?
Yeah, we were.
For defending the food table?
Guys,
Come here. You can't go over there. You'll get arrested.
Watch
So you
out.
just got out?
Yeah, we just got out. But
What was their basis for arresting you?
criminal trespassing. I was sitting in front of, I was protecting our food table. We were sitting down. I was hugging this guy actually, that's why I got arrested.
That's so bullshit, man.
Yeah, it's a lot of bullshit.
We just all got out probably an hour ago, less than that. All we were really doing was just practicing our First Amendment to speech, you know, and peacefully congregate and state our grievances to our government. If we can't even do that in the state capital of our, you know, and go to City Hall and state our grievances, I don't know what we're supposed to do now. Like, where do we go now?
And
Are they going to do it in Washington when we go there as well? I bet they will. And
absolutely.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to get arrested 3 times in 1 week. I just can't
And you know,
do it.
the
I can't
ordinances
do
that
it.
they're trying to reinforce aren't even ordinances yet. They're memos. You know, the things that they arrested us for aren't even legitimate. They can't even talk to us. They don't even know the laws that they're enforcing. They're blindly.
Bill of Rights trumps any ordinances.
Exactly.
It trumps. That's the only laws that we as citizens of America have to follow. Being here, living here, not ordinances, nothing.
Especially
not even
ordinances
local
that
laws.
aren't even real. They're drafts.
There you go. First Amendment.
My name is Bob Jensen. I was down at the Occupy Austin gathering today on Sunday to try and offer an analysis of the systems that are creating the problems that come together in this cry about the 1%. And I suggested that there were really 3 key questions about empire, economics, and ecology, that we need to look first at the role of the United States as an imperial power, like other great powers in the history of the world, an imperial power that has used its military might to gather a disproportionate share of the world's resources, usually through violence, coercion, and the threat of violence. So although we tell ourselves a story in the United States about the US being a uniquely benevolent power, the reality is quite different, that the United States has used that military power to project around the world that kind of dominance and control. The current invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq are not unique in that sense. They're not the product of just a bad politician or a bad administration. They're the product of this imperial mindset, and so we have to reject politically that imperial position of the United States. And of course, the empire building serves an economy, the economy of a predatory corporate capitalism. And we need to, again, realize the problem is not just the specific people in the boardrooms of America's corporations, but the nature of that economic system. And I suggest that the way to define the problem of capitalism can be by pointing out that capitalism is inhuman, it's anti-democratic, and it's unsustainable. It's inhuman because it offers an understanding of human nature that says we're nothing but greedy, self-interested bastards, and that you have to organize an economy around greed and self-interest, otherwise we would basically starve. And of course, human history is full of times, periods, and examples of people acting not on greed and self-interest, but on solidarity, community, and compassion. And so challenging that notion of capitalism's claim about human nature is important. Capitalism is anti-democratic because it concentrates wealth. And when you concentrate wealth, you concentrate political power. And there's no way to achieve a democratic distribution of power when you're concentrating wealth in the way capitalism does. And finally, capitalism is unsustainable. It's an economic system based on the notion of unlimited growth on a finite planet. And there is no way you can make those two square. And so if, in fact, capitalism forces us into the worst of human nature, if it destroys the possibility of democracy, and if it's unsustainable, it's inconsistent with our own principles. And therefore, we need to change the political system, the economic system, if we're going to have a sustainable ecological system. So I don't know if you're all going to follow this. Hold on, this is some bold new theoretical thinking I've been doing. Are you all ready? All right. Unsustainable systems cannot be sustained. Okay, maybe not so bold after all. It seems rather straightforward, yes? All right, that's the reality. We have chosen, so-called chosen, an economic system that is inhuman, anti-democratic, and unsustainable. Does that seem sane and rational to you? No, in fact, resistance to capitalism, I think, is sanity and rationality. Now let's deal with that question about sustainability. We talked about empire, we talked about economics, now we have to talk about ecology. So far my talk has been upbeat and positive, but now we have to deal with reality that is always going to sort of bring us down. And that is the ecological realities in 2011. Right? Here, if you want to look at any measure of the underlying health of the ecosphere that makes our own lives possible, how well is the planet doing? Look at any measure you want, and I don't care what measure you choose. Topsoil loss, water contamination, in fact, profound changes in the hydrological cycle, chemical contamination of everything from the soil to our own bodies, the number and growing size of the dead zones in the oceans, right? And of course, this minor inconvenience called climate disruption. Look at any measure you want of the underlying health of the ecosphere, and the news is all bad. What we have been living through really the last 250 years is an era of incredibly rapid expansion that was subsidized by cheap energy. And there's two things we have to come to terms with. One is that industrial era subsidized by cheap energy has brought us to the brink of suicide. The second thing is, oh, by the way, that energy is running out. And we have two massive ecological questions. One is, how are we going to pull back from burning the energy sources we have to try and create a sustainable ecosystem? And the second is, how are we going to live in this modern industrial infrastructure when that cheap energy is running out? Now, the point of stepping back and trying to think about these systems, we talked about the political system, the economic system, and the industrial system. The point again is to suggest that the analysis we need to understand why the 1% are running the world and running it badly is to recognize the problem is not the people who currently occupy those positions in the 1%. It's not that they're just particularly bad people. No doubt they are. I've yet to meet a rich person I liked or respected. I don't know any rich people I like or respect. But that's not because I think rich people are genetically flawed from birth. It has something to do with what happens when you become part of that 1%. Okay? So the question isn't how do we replace the 1% with a different 1%, or even how do we replace the current political leadership with a better class of people. That's not the problem. The problem is in the nature of the systems that currently define the modern world. Now, here's my last comment, and then I'll make good on my promise to be rather brief. When you step back and try to analyze systems, the first thing that people will tell you is, well, that's not realistic. Correct? You've heard this, yes? When you start to offer a critique of the basic systems, people say, that's not realistic. I would like someone to explain to me why it's realistic to argue for the perpetuation of systems that have brought us to the edge of ecocide. Does that seem realistic to you? To recognize the systems themselves are fundamentally flawed, but say we must continue within those systems. Again, that seems to me to be irrational and to be fundamentally insane. So our job is to be realistic in some deeper sense, to be willing to reflect on the nature of these systems, tell the truth about those systems, and start to envision some sort of different world. Now, I don't think that's going to happen today, tomorrow, next week. It's going to happen through the experiments that are going on around the country and around the world. So my last comment, it's really not a comment, but a clipboard, because the world will be improved with more clipboards. That's my theory. So part of what I do, in addition to teach in college, is work with a variety of community organizations. The one that is sort of my home base is called the Third Coast Activist Resource Center, a name that's rather vague on purpose, because when you have plans for secret revolutions, you've got to keep your name vague. Okay? So, but don't tell anybody else about the plan for the secret revolution. The Third Coast Activist Resource Center is a group concerned about justice on the global scale. One of the things we do is we operate an email list which brings together news of progressive events going on around Austin, both events that we sponsor and events other people are sponsoring. It's a once a week email list, announcement only, no spam. If you're not on the email list, some of you may know it as the no war list, which is what we called it when we started. Obviously it came out of anti-war organizing. I'm going to pass around the clipboard, put your email address on it, and I'll subscribe you to it. The Third Coast Activist Resource Center is also a partner in a great community center that some of you may know at 5604 Manor Road over in East Austin. The main group at 5604 is the Workers' Defense Project, which is an amazing immigrant worker. Anybody here know about the Workers' Defense Project? Hey! Hey! PJL! Hey! Okay, yeah, okay. So the Workers' Defense Project has been doing amazing work with immigrant workers, often undocumented immigrant workers, who are of course the most vulnerable workers in society with the fewest rights. And what the Workers' Defense Project is doing is creating a different way of organizing. And they're doing it through not petitioning the powerful to make the world better, but that experiment of making the world better. There's also a group called Third Coast Workers for Cooperation there, which helps worker-owned, worker-run businesses get off the ground with training and support. Another really fabulous group. Third Coast is part of this experiment. If you haven't been over to 5604 Manor, I encourage you to come to one of the events. There will be a series of things going on over the next month that bring people together in new ways. What's especially important about 5604 Manor, and this will be my last comment, is, as many of you know, Austin is a very, very harshly segregated city. That interstate was built to divide black and brown East Austin from white West Austin. And one of the things that many of us with progressive values have been trying to do is how do you bridge that divide? And 5604 Manor was conceived of explicitly as a place for cross-racial organizing, where folks from groups like mine, which is predominantly white, can come together with predominantly black and brown groups and try to create something new. So I hope you can find a way to get over to 5604 Manor and help us do that. If you argue that greed and a system based on greed and self-interest is not the only way to organize human society, the question is, well, what are the alternatives? And there's two answers to that. One comes from the modern period and one comes from all of human history. Let's do the modern period first. It's interesting that whenever systems arise that try to challenge that, how does the dominant system respond? They respond with violence. So for instance, the example people often use is Spain, right, where there was an attempt to develop a society outside both of Stalinist totalitarianism and outside of Western capitalism. And what was interesting is the violence that was used to smash that experiment. So there have been attempts all over the place in the modern era to rise up and do something different, but they tend to be crushed. You're also right that contemporary capitalism is not the only system based on hierarchy, authority, and inequality. Right? Feudalism, right? Medieval feudalism, not a terribly good system. I'm not advocating we go back to that. Right? Okay, so capitalism is not the only system based on hierarchy and inequality. It simply is the one we have to respond to today. So when can you look to a period in human history when those weren't the values, hierarchy and inequality? And in fact, most of human history was lived under very, very different circumstances. Let's do a little quick sort of history lesson. Human beings, Homo sapiens, animals indistinguishable from us, have been on the planet, let's say roughly 200,000 years. We only have about 10,000 years of what we call civilization, beginning with the rise of agriculture. That means 190,000 years of human history. That's 95% of our evolutionary history were lived in hunter-gatherer societies, band-level societies, probably no bigger than about 100, certainly no bigger than 150. Well, what was the fundamental mode of social organization in band-level societies? It was not unlike what you hear. It wasn't based on a tribe and a single powerful leader. The archaeology and anthropology we have, as well as the data on existing gathering and hunting societies, demonstrates that those societies lived on cooperative communal values. They were not hierarchical. Now, that doesn't mean they were perfect societies. They were also violent when they interacted with others. You don't have to romanticize the pre-civilization part of human history, to recognize that these values that we claim to be natural are in fact not natural. In fact, they're distinctly unnatural if we want to take 95% of our evolutionary history as evidence of what is human nature. Now, that doesn't help us understand how we're going to live today, because unless you want to see, a good portion of the world's population die quickly, we are not going back to a gathering and hunting societies based on band-level organizations of 100. We've got a serious challenge to move from a world of 7 billion people based on an unsustainable political, economic, and ecological idea to something that's going to work. I don't pretend to have an idea. If I did, if I came to you and said, here's the plan, you should laugh at me and run away. Because no single human being, no group of people can imagine they have the answer to that question. The answer is in recognizing the unsustainable, anti-democratic, inhuman nature of the system and trying experiments, trying different ways of organizing. That's the way I think. The story of the financial meltdown in Iceland is well known now. Iceland got greedy. Iceland, let its banks loose. What's more interesting is what Iceland did after the collapse. And they've essentially sort of regrouped in a way that I think is much more interesting, based not on the way we regrouped in the US, which was to further empower the banks, but in fact to rein them in. I don't know enough about the details about how it's working out, but I think that Iceland is the poster child for the failure. And notice how nobody's talking much about what's happened in the aftermath and how they rebuilt society around different lines. An experiment in Italy where people have sort of taken charge of themselves and broken away from the system to the degree you can. I think that those experiences, experiments, and successes you can find everywhere. The one people have heard the most about is the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region in Spain, which are worker-owned, worker-run cooperatives, which around the world have worked at a small level. What's great about Mondragon is they've scaled up to an industrial level, really. There are large-scale businesses in Mondragon that have been quite successful. Again, we don't need to be naive or romantic and say these experiments are the blueprint for the world. Human beings, although my argument was we're not just greedy and self-interested, we're also kind of nasty beings. We're capable of all sorts of bad stuff, and when you put us in groups, some of that comes out. So we don't want to be overly romantic, but we also don't want to be overly cynical. And I think these examples are really, really great. And they're also not new. They've been going on for a long, long time. Intentional communities that have broken with the dominant culture are a permanent feature of American life. Some of you may have heard of Helen and Scott Nearing, and a really inspirational story, one of my favorites, who were, Scott Nearing was a professor destined for a life of uselessness, of course, like most professors. And one really great thing happened to Scott Nearing. He got fired. He got fired in the early part of the 20th century for the radical position of opposing child labor. Okay, that was radical back then. Then he was fired from his next job for opposing U.S. entry into World War I. And what he and his wife Helen did was break away, and they were early homesteaders. And they wrote a couple of very good books about how you can actually make that work. And one of the key things was not going into debt. Right, staying away to the degree you can from that economic system. Right? Now that's a sort of low-level, individual-level response, but as you're pointing out, those individual responses can also be aggregated, and I think that's where the juice is in this world. The real action isn't in Washington. The action is very much, I think, at that level. The question about, as we try and build these communal responses, there is still this thing called the U.S. government, and there is still the state legislature, and they still do have power, and they control the coercive mechanisms of the society. And so you can't pretend they're just going to go away.
Right? Yes, they are going to go away.
Okay, well,
yes, they are.
Okay, well.
Yes, they are.
So the question is, remember this system is a democratic system. Right? That's not all illusion. Right? As long as wealth is concentrated, it's very difficult to imagine breaking the power of that wealth to dominate. But the history of the United States is also the history of democratic interventions into that. Now, again, one doesn't want to be romantic. People always point to things like the civil rights movement, the feminist, these social movements that changed the distribution of power. And in some ways they did. I don't think there's anybody here probably who would want to go back. I was born in 1958. Does anybody want to go back to the way the world was organized in 1958?
I want to go back to the
No.
20s.
Okay, so the question is, how do you be realistic about those democratic interventions that are possible without believing that somehow the system of power is going to fade away just because people get out and connect? I don't have an answer to that either. I think what seems to be the case is that those systems that seem impenetrable, they are impenetrable up until the time they fall. Right? There's an old line, I've never been able to track this down, but it's my favorite quote, and whether it's real or not, I don't care. Maybe it's not, but it's just as good either way. And it's usually attributed to some Roman historian or Roman general. And the quote is that nothing looks as invincible as a great army on the morning of its greatest defeat. Right? That these things that seem impenetrable, right, in fact are not. And there's all sorts of examples. The one that you hear a lot about is the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines in the 1980s. All right, this US-backed dictator who had sophisticated weapons supplied by the United States. He was backed by US presidents, Republican and Democrat alike. He was a thug. Right? Ferdinand Marcos was the worst kind of third world dictator. And he seemed to have a complete lock on power in the Philippines up until the point when he didn't. When the so-called people power movement successfully through nonviolent organizing challenged Marcos. And then one day the police and the military that was behind Marcos wasn't there anymore. All right? That's happened in society after society. But here's the other thing. This isn't the Philippines. This is the center of modern capitalism. There's a lot riding on this, and the people in power are not going to go as easily as Ferdinand Marcos did. So I think we have to be realistic about that. I personally don't see any quick answer to this. The question is really about, let's assume there's some transitional phase. What do the current structures of government and economy have to do with this transition? And this is one of those things where I don't think anybody's got a crystal ball. I certainly don't. There are certainly ways that you can make rather simple steps that are not unprecedented that would change the dynamics considerably. So when the banks were on the verge of collapse, there was, in some circles, discussion about what seemed like a pretty obvious solution. But do you mind if I use the vernacular? Nationalize the fucking banks. It's not that fucking hard. Nationalize the motherfucker. Okay, so that was an option. Within the, that wouldn't have meant, the end of capitalism. That just meant you've got a failing institution. Here's an appropriate role for national government to come in and change that failure. Now, we didn't do that. We didn't do that because that concentration of wealth made it impossible for the people in power to do that at the moment. But there's no reason that you couldn't build up the kind of democratic potential, not to overthrow capitalism tomorrow, but to understand that there are these intermediate steps. Right? Another one, which people talk a lot about, is healthcare. Right? Yeah. We have a completely unsustainable healthcare system. Right? Not just because there's no national health insurance, or not just because the rich get, but because we built up this high-tech medical system that is fundamentally not going to work indefinitely. Right? So we're told that we can't imagine a national healthcare system, and we can't imagine rationing. Why? Because we're told that it can't be done. The problem is, depending on the surveys you look at, somewhere between a bare majority and a significant majority of the American public actually support those kinds of things. And so that's where the traction is. Right? It would be nice to imagine walking into Congress and saying, listen, here's the proof that capitalism is inhuman, anti-democratic, and unsustainable. Let's change it. Not likely to happen. You look for these wedge issues, these places where you can get traction, I think. He's saying that the job of Congress is to look out for the general welfare. That's a good one, buddy.
Well, what's your question?
Put this guy on Leno. I mean, come on. Okay, so
ideally,
yeah.
What's his question?
So the question is it not in the founding documents of the United States of America that government is the servant of the people, not the master? And it's worth reflecting on that. That was a pretty radical idea at the moment the United States came into being. Sovereignty was not vested in king or an aristocratic class. sovereignty was vested in the people. And that means that the people are on top of the chart, and the government serves the people. What we all know has happened is, actually an interesting story, is number one, that was never as simple a project as we thought, because of course wealth was concentrated at the founding of this country, not in corporate hands. Corporations, for the most part, when the United States were founded, were a marginal part of the economy. But over time, what's happened is corporations, by declaring themselves through the legal system to be persons, have now not only become on par with the public, with people, but in fact have become superior to the people in the concentration of power. So now, instead of the correct chain, which would be the people running a government, which then assigns some rights to corporations, we have exactly the opposite. The corporations run the government with the people on the bottom. That's antithetical to the spirit of the founding documents. And yes, you can go back to those documents and find the really quite eloquent articulations. Even if imperfectly manifested in the beginning, they are still there. How do we do that? Well, that's where the founding documents don't mean shit. It's what we do with them today that matters. Power is essentially, to some degree, an illusion. Right? Power only works if enough people accept that. Power is basically the illusion of legitimacy. I have power apparently enough to, you're all willing to sit here and listen, whatever. But the minute you decide, listen, this fucking crackpot professor isn't worth shit, you walk away, I have no power. So yes, power is in a sense created when people agree to the legitimacy of an institution or a person. Right? That's true enough. But the other thing that people in power have right now is essentially a monopoly on violence for the most part. Right? They also control those institutions that have the legal claim to use violence. Now, that's not a trivial thing, especially in the degree to which the intensity of that violent potential. So yes, if we woke up, if you could get enough people in the United States to wake up one day and say, we no longer recognize the legitimacy of the corporate form, and we will not respect the rights of a corporation, nor will we respect anyone in power who is allied with corporations. Okay. The problem is there's a lot of guns behind that power. That legitimacy is backed by violence and the threat of violence.
The people holding the guns are suffering from, they're idiots. They're killing their own dogs because the dogs feed from us.
Right.
You know what I mean? Not to call everybody who's...
And it's true that sometimes there are people within the mechanisms of state power and violence that do turn. That's a kind of revolutionary moment. But I think whatever one thinks about it, in the United States, on October 30th, 2011, we are not at a revolutionary moment. That's the reality. One is the recognition, as you said, that legal rights don't really mean anything unless there is popular support for those rights. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has not changed since it was written, yet it has meant different things throughout time. There were times in U.S. history where the First Amendment right to express yourself, to quote the cop, don't mean shit. Right? People were jailed for merely speaking out against World War I, for instance. In the post-World War II era, the anti-communist hysteria meant that there was fundamentally no freedom of expression in the United States. So these rights are meaningful to the degree there is popular support to demand those rights, and that's an important thing to remember. The second point I've already forgotten, so I'll go to the third. The third was about how do you sort of change the consciousness. And to me, events like the Occupy gatherings are important. They're a kind of spontaneous moment, but they themselves are not a politics. The politics that I'm most sort of committed to is the slow work of building networks and institutions at the very, very grassroots level. And I spoke about the building that we're part of over in East Austin, 5604 Manor, and that's an example of what you're talking to. That here you have in Austin a very segregated city, and the politics on the left tend to be segregated as well. How do you bridge that? The only way I know how to do it is that people like me, who are older, white, privileged with some sort of resources, have to contribute all of that to grassroots organizing efforts to try and make the world more just. And for me, that was this one building and this group called the Workers' Defense Project, which is a predominantly Latino immigrant group. right? And so instead of just talking about it, what some of us are doing is, aiding in that project. And what that does is not only advance a specific project, like justice for workers who are cheated by employers, but it also builds those connections. And those connections you don't just magically bring into existence because you want to make a better world. They're built through long-term commitment to shared values and shared projects. And it really does take a long, long time to do that. The way I would sum this up is in the title of a book that was analyzing the energy crisis. And the book I have problems with, but I love the title. The title is called The Long Emergency. And that's the way I would describe the moment in history we're in. We have to dig in for the long emergency. It is truly an emergency. I mean, this world could be over within the lifetime of the younger ones among us. Probably not me. I'm close enough to the grave that I think I'm going to die a natural death, maybe. But it's not impossible to imagine the collapse of systems, political, economic, and ecological systems, that might mean that large-scale human life on this planet as we have known it is no longer a given. That's an emergency, right? You don't sit around and say, well, let's take 12 or 13 years to figure, At the same time, there is no immediate project that is clearly going to turn this around. And so digging in for this notion of a kind of long emergency, it may seem kind of paradoxical, but that's the way I think about it. That you recognize the urgency of the situation, but also commit to long-term organizing that builds those networks and institutions that will be on the ground when things change. And remember, I said this is not a revolutionary moment in the United States, and I think that's quite evident. But the thing is, you can't predict when revolutionary moments are going to come. I said I was born in 1958. For those of you who know history or lived through it, in 1958, the United States was politically locked down. It was in the grips of a reactionary anti-communism. It was an apartheid state. Women were relegated to second-class status. Gays and lesbians didn't exist. There was no recognition about what was going on ecologically. Right? In 1968, a decade after I was born, the world was literally on fire. Every major system in the world was under assault. The government of France almost fell in the summer of 1968 because of reactions to the collapse of the system. The US, every system in the US was being challenged. No one in 1958, on the day I was born, could have predicted that within a decade everything would be up for grabs. You never know when revolutionary moments are coming. Now, I don't want to be naive again. The revolutionary moment of 1968 didn't produce a transformation. We're still stuck with the same system, slightly more civilized in some ways. Right? But you can't predict those moments. What's important is when those moments come, there are those networks of people and those institutions on the ground where people can come together to strategize and to fight. And that's what I think is important. Building for that long emergency is crucial. The reference was to the Rainbow Family, which I don't have a lot of experience with beyond having read a few things about it. But again, I would emphasize that there are all sorts of models of alternatives. I once worked at a Catholic college run by a monastery. Think about a monastery. A monastery is an alternative model. It's a model in communal living based on shared values. Nobody in a monastery, asks who made more money that year. Right? Now, you might say, well, yeah, monasteries have some other problems. They do, right? Again, there is no human organization that's perfect. But you can see this spirit of collaborative, cooperative, communal living is hard to repress, no matter how much this system says, if you engage in that, you're a loser, which is basically what the system says, yes? If you're interested in cooperative, collaborative, communal living, what are you? You're a fucking loser. I mean, why don't you go get a job? Okay? So even though the culture constantly harasses and harangues everybody who wants to try alternatives, people do it. You can't repress it. That tells me that spirit is actually quite strong in human beings. And all of these experiments, some are clearly not models for a large-scale human organization. Right? Some have varying levels of kind of flakiness attached to them, flakiness from my point of view. Right? But that doesn't matter. I think your point is well taken, that they're all models of people resisting. And coming together 1 month a year isn't a model for a different economy in a technical sense, but it's a model for a different kind of relationship. And I think any place those relationships are being nurtured, sometimes in very conventional institutions even, right? That's important. And again, here's another piece of evidence that you can't keep this down. Just look at all of the interest in gardening these days, right? In people who want to grow food. Right? Now, people do it for different reasons. Sometimes they just like digging in the dirt. Sometimes they just, are trying to save a buck here and there. But there's been a huge surge of interest in urban agriculture, gardening, sustainable agriculture. All of these things, to me, are indications that people at some level, even if their analysis is relatively undeveloped, that people recognize the existing system does not serve human needs and will not continue indefinitely. Cheap food in supermarkets will not be available forever. And here in Austin, there's something called the Sustainable Food Center. It's not a radical organization. It doesn't even have any clear politics beyond sustainable food. Yet it's bringing together people with a variety of ideas. There's a group called Urban Roots, which gives high school students the experience of farming. Right? There's a group called the Green Corn Project, which helps people put in gardens in their house. Right? There's just a ton of stuff going on, all of which to me is an expression of that spirit. We don't want to do it the way people in power tell us we have to do it. And any of those are examples that that spirit can't be permanently crushed, I think. Thank you all. I have one last thought, and then we can chat informally if you want. I've been thinking a lot about the pundits and the politicians when they're commenting on the Occupy gatherings. The one thing that's consistent, what do they all say? They say, we don't know what their demands are. You've heard this, yes? They don't have demands. We need to know what their demands are. I finally figured out what the demand of the Occupy movement should be. Now, I can't impose this on you, but I think it will really, really resonate with you. Really? You ready? The demand of the Occupy gathering should be, we demand that you stop demanding that we have demands. There it is. Our demand is that you no longer demand that we have demands.
We demand empathy.
And what that means, of course, is what is already circulating, which is this is not the articulation of politics in the traditional form. It's not business as usual. It's not here. We want some concession from this system.
Yes.
It's an articulation of a sometimes chaotic but clear rejection of those systems.
Yes.
And the next step is not just action. Action is important in politics, but analysis is important too. And that's what I hope we could talk about, and we did talk about today, is what is the analysis necessary to start to reshape that world. So thanks for being here.
I love that you're here.
Great.
And we thank you very much.
My
Please
pleasure.
come back next week whenever you can, please.
Will do.
Whenever you have a moment.
Will do. Hi.
You know, you talked about, I guess, the disparities in like 1958, but in some ways, like, while personal liberty was very restricted, economic freedom was more just.
The distribution of wealth was not as concentrated.
Right.
The fundamental economic system was just as unjust from my point of view, because I'm anti-capitalist.
Right.
So I don't think there's ever been a moment in the history of capitalism where there was anything approaching justice. But you're absolutely right, the distribution of wealth was far more egalitarian.
We had a much more progressive system of taxation.
Right.
Top income tax bracket was like 90%.
And that's a good point that, you know, we want to think about history as this linear thing where there's progress. But you're right, in 1958, the economic system was more egalitarian. The social system was much harsher and less egalitarian.
Right.
Both things are true. Right? And so if you look at 1958 and 2011, there's been enormous progress on some fronts. Right? And there has been enormous regression on other fronts.
Yes.
And both things are true. And that's what's so kind of maddening, is that the system concedes on some grounds. I mean, we now have women on the U.S. Supreme Court, right? People of color on the U.S. Supreme Court. Is that a good thing? Yes. Is it a good thing that Clarence Thomas is, you know, a representative, quote unquote, of the black population? Not from my point of view, because I think he's got regressive politics. Okay. But, you know, that's what's so maddening about living in this world, I think.
But I mean, okay, in 1958, anti-communism was at its peak.
Right.
Yet, we had a much more progressive, I guess, system of taxation and higher membership in labor unions.
Yeah, and it's true.
And when anytime anyone tries to bring up progressive taxation, it's immediately discarded as class warfare.
It's
and
also
socialism.
true that the ability of the U.S. public to articulate opposition to U.S. imperial wars is far greater today than then. So when the United States was going about the business of slaughtering people in other countries in 1958, there was virtually no one in the U.S. crying out.
Right.
So we've gained ground on that. The critique of U.S. imperial war is far more developed today than it was in 1958, when the United States started destroying Vietnam, which it did under the Eisenhower administration by fueling the reactionary forces. There was no outcry of that. Right? It wasn't until the mid to late 1960s. Right? So yes, in 1958, more labor organizing and union membership, more progressive taxation, and less opposition to U.S. barbarism abroad, more internal repression for the big chunks of the population.
Right.
It was better and it was worse. Both things are true. So, but that's true of most of human history,
So how do you think that this movement could maybe reignite, I guess, a spirit of progressivism?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But I don't think anybody else does either.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
I mean,
That's why we don't have
there is what's going on. And, there's the attempt to resist being cleared out of public space.
Mm-hmm.
There's people coming together across boundaries to connect in ways they didn't. There's simply the act of talking in public. What we did now, in some sense, is part of. Yeah. But that's it. But all of history is complex like this. You look at feudalism. Does anybody want to go back to a feudal society? No, but there were bonds in feudal societies that were deeper than the bonds in capitalism, right? That if you're a serf, serfs had a pretty shitty life. But serfs also had a right to certain kinds of basic subsistence that people don't have anymore. Right? So the fact that the world is far more civilized today, and the fact that in feudal times there were more authentic connections and understandings of obligations among human beings, again, both things are true. I don't know. Personally, I think we should consider also that the human species might just be an evolutionary dead end. That humans with the big brain have both this capacity, this phenomenal capacity to intervene in and control the world in ways that, not even thinkable for any other species. Yet we don't appear to have the capacity to check the worst of our excesses. Okay, so maybe it is just the case that we're an experiment in history like other species, and that we'll go the way of others. Okay, that's true enough. That's possible too. And the question is, if that's the case, how do we try and make,
Prevent that from happening.
prevent it from happening, or recognizing our limitations?
Well, see, the current world order is not equipped to meet the challenges of the coming century. Scarcity of resources, overpopulation, and climate change.
Not only not prepared, it can't even, for a lot of people, it can't even recognize the nature of the crisis.
So
I agree.
Short-term gains, short-term thinking, get as rich as fast as you possibly can without any thought as to the long-term ramifications of what's going on.
Absolutely. And that's a recipe for suicide.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, okay. So, the big, what scares me is in order for collectively the human species to react to something like climate disruption, you first have to recognize the nature of the threat. And in this country, there are significant forces that want to undermine people's capacity to even recognize the nature of the threat. Right? So, before you can solve a problem, you have to recognize there is a problem. It doesn't mean, recognizing there is a problem doesn't mean it's soluble. Right? There are problems beyond solutions, but you at least have to recognize it as a problem. And at this point, there are such forces arrayed to undermine our capacity to see the nature of the problems that I get very, very nervous, very, very scared about what's coming. And I don't think one can naively say, well, people power is going to, I mean, we're looking at forces that have built up over centuries and decades and are very, very sophisticated. Right? And that's both
Until they blow up.
But it's also possible that forces achieve such power that when they blow up, they blow everything up.
Yeah,
We're not
I
talking
think
about
that's
Moscow in 1917. We're talking about the United States in 2011, right? With a military capacity unknown in human history, right? With a sophisticated technological apparatus unknown in human history, and with an ecosystem that is more fragile than ever before. and a group of people in power who show every indication that they will choose the Samson option and bring the whole fucking temple down if pressed. Right? That's not trivial stuff. I mean, that keeps me in a state of, basically constant agitation.
First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. Then you win.
I heard them say the revolution won't be televised. Al Jazeera proved them wrong. Twitter has them paralyzed.